Story 1. Jim Carrey. I literally bumped into him as I was walking into a cafe in New York City about 10 years ago. He said, "Pardon me." He did a little half jig and held the door open for me. He made me blush as if I were the main character of a trashy romance novel. It was magical. I will remember those 15 seconds forever. Story 2. I went to watch Ex Machina with friend 1, friend 2, and friend 2's wife. People were waiting by the auditorium door because staff were still cleaning up from the previous screening. None other than Keanu Reeves casually walked up with a motorcycle helmet under his arm, a large bucket of popcorn in one hand, and a large drink in the other. Everyone waiting noticed but left him alone, including me and my 2 friends. Friend 2's wife insisted we go talk to him and ask for a photo. Friend 2 and I said no, leave him alone. He is probably tired of people approaching him, but friend 1 offered to go with her. She walked up, introduced herself, and asked if she could have a photo. Keanu graciously said yes. After friend 1 took the photo, Keanu asked, "Do you like that shot? Do you want to do another one?" They did another, and she was over the moon. Just another story of Keanu being an awesome person. Story 3. I saw Jack Black in Amsterdam. I was walking quickly and we recognized him. He twiddled his fingers as he went past, said hello, and kept strolling. It was the most Jack Black thing I could have imagined. Story 4. I've met a few famous people, Jimmy Stewart and Ronald Reagan among them. My favorite was when I met James Garner. He was on the set of a movie where I worked as an extra. When he learned a group of Marines were extras, he spent his entire lunch break with us. He was the consummate gentleman. He signed autographs, answered questions, told stories, and asked about our lives. Felt like spending time with a favorite uncle. We had a great time and were impressed by him. Story 5. Ben Stiller visited the store where I was working. He is polite, but my biggest takeaway was that he is very small, almost as if he were an actor for ants. Story 6. Jamie Lee Curtis was in Beverly Hills. She saw me with my dog and came up to me and said, "Your dog is so cute. What's her name?" I said, "Lulu," and she replied, "Oh my God, that's my daughter's name. Can I take a picture?" I said, "Sure," and brought Lulu up to my face. She was a 3-pound toy poodle, and Jamie Lee Curtis said, "Not you. I don't even know you, just the dog." Story 7. I was at Whole Foods in Green Hills and saw a remarkably tall, thin woman in the produce section. She was Nicole Kidman. We did not interact, but she is incredibly beautiful. Story 8. When I was a 12-year-old girl, I ran into Billy Gibbons in Hawaii and asked for a photo. He was very sweet and chuckled when I told him I recognized him not from ZZ Top, but as Angela's dad from my favorite television show Bones. Story 9. I saw Cameron Diaz 3 weeks ago. She was crossing the street with a small child, completely enthralled. She looked like the happiest person on the planet. It was very heartwarming. Incidentally, we were both wearing Canadian tuxedos, which felt life-affirming. Story 10. I stood at a crosswalk with Peter Dinklage and his dog for about 15 seconds. It was magical. Story 11. In the early 1970s, before auto racing became such big business and drivers had their own motorhomes, I was at a race. I needed to use the restroom. At that track, the facilities were just a glorified outhouse with 2 or 3 stainless steel urinals. A driver came in, we exchanged a nod, and each minded our own business. My claim to fame is that I urinated next to Mario Andretti. Story 12. I was a bouncer at a bar in La Jolla and Robin Williams walked past me. He saw me do a double take and gave me a wink and a smile. I miss him. He is a childhood hero of mine. Story 13. Richard Simmons. I was at the Philadelphia airport, standing outside and smoking while waiting for my friend to pick me up. It was cold and lightly snowing. He came out in his signature shorts and a large parka. As he hurried to his car, he called out to me, "Smoking is bad. Quit now. People love you." Story 14. Ringo did a show at the casino where I worked. Talent came in through an underground tunnel. I was passing through when Ringo and 2 men walked by. I said, "Wow, hi." He said hello, flashed a peace sign, and gave me a little fist bump. I called my dad and told him I had touched a beetle. Story 15. I drove Paul Newman around the Indy 500 track for about half a day in a golf cart, so he was right next to me. He was recording a tribute piece for a retiring driver, and they divided the work across 3 areas. He was old and small, but he still had those intense blue eyes. I didn't know who it would be until I picked him up, so I was a little starstruck when he hopped in, but I held it together. Story 16. I saw Lady Gaga at an event for creatives. I had no idea it was her. She was dressed casually and introduced herself as Stephanie. She was very nice. Story 17. Alice Cooper came into the shop where I worked in the 90s in London. He was humble and kind. Story 18. Mr. Rogers at the Atlanta airport in 1980. I was 16. He was exactly how you would expect him to be, kind and gracious to someone who had been a fan from day one. Story 19. Dick Van Dyke patted my son's head while he was in his stroller and said, "Cute kid." My son is now 42 and Dick is still kicking at 99. Story 20. I met Katy Perry. While I was talking to her, I received a phone call from a friend, and Katy asked if she could answer it. Story 21. Long story short, both John Belushi and Bill Murray tried to throw my friend and me out of Saturday Night Live Friday rehearsals, but Dan Aykroyd saved us. John was a sad case, Bill was a genuine jerk, and Dan was a good human being. The ladies Jane, Gilda, and Lorraine were awesome, and it was amazing that the 2 of us, eating our stolen lunches, were the only ones watching the Talking Heads rehearse. Story 22. John Heder was at Comic-Con. I was wearing a Vote for Pedro shirt, and he was one of the guests. He complimented me on my shirt, and I, for lack of a better word, panicked. Story 23. This happened around 2003. I was at Cedar Point with my vocal class for a competition when I was in 7th grade. I had been a huge fan of the band NSYNC for a few years and saw Joey Fatone walking through the park with his wife. I walked up to him and asked, "Are you Joey from NSYNC?" He replied, "Well, not anymore, but I was in NSYNC. Want to go on a ride?" He and his kind wife let this awkward preteen interrupt their day to go on the Mantis roller coaster. It was so kind of them, and I was so excited I forgot to buy the picture from the roller coaster photo booth. It was a wholesome interaction. I had a really difficult home life then, and that kindness meant so much to me as a kid. Story 24. I sat next to Dolly Parton on an American Airlines flight from Nashville to Los Angeles in the mid-1990s. She was the sweetest, most accommodating person and graciously greeted anyone who approached her. That changed when the flight attendants banned people from standing in the aisles and crowding the first-class cabin. Story 25. John Waters walked up to me while I was on a smoke break during my first job. He asked me for a cigarette and for walking directions to a business. I had just smoked my last cigarette and accidentally sent him the wrong way. I still cringe about it 15 years later. Story 26. I stood next to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar while the national anthem was playing during his time with the Milwaukee Bucks. His aura was incredible. Story 27. Eric Andre tried to steal my bagel. My wife and I were in Brooklyn on vacation to watch the Liberty play. I got up early to get a bagel at a neighborhood shop. There was a long line, so I had to wait outside. Down the street came a man who looked a lot like Eric Andre walking a small dog. As he approached the shop, he scooped up the dog and put it in a crossbody bag. He got in line, and I was still not sure it was him. Then another man in line asked how it worked and where to order, and Andre explained it in his distinctive voice. I ordered, and when my bagel was ready, Andre thought it was his and went to claim it. It was just a misunderstanding, but that was my brush with fame. Story 28. I met the best skaters in the world in 2000. I had Bucky Lassek's sweat on me, and I walked Tony Hawk to his car in the parking lot while we were vibing. It was honestly an otherworldly experience. Story 29. I served The Rock when his wrestling career was just starting to take off. He was the nicest guy and came across as humble. He made sure to take pictures with the staff and tipped me generously. Story 30. When I was 8 years old, I sat next to LL Cool J after he performed in my hometown. He was flying to Kansas City for his next show. I recognized him, and he was very kind to an 8-year-old. I will always be a fan. I took my son to the New York City Comic Con when he was 9. My son and I both watched the Cosmos series together, and I encourage his interest in science. While we were walking down the street, we were surprised to see Neil deGrasse Tyson, who lived in that neighborhood. I shouted his full name, which startled him and my wife. My son and I were starstruck. I apologized and said we were huge fans, then asked to shake his hand. He smiled and obliged. It was the era of selfies, but I felt I should leave him alone afterward. He was very kind and said he appreciated that we were fans. Story 31. I saw Bob Geldof at a film festival. He was a complete jerk. Postscript. I used to work in music publishing. I still do to some extent, and I have met numerous celebrities in my time, none of whom left as bad an impression as Geldof. Story 32. Tina Turner and Emmylou Harris. Not at the same time though. I worked in the same building as the V103 radio station in Atlanta, and I knew one of the engineers who told me Tina Turner was stopping by. She was so zen. I have a fairly firm handshake, and when I shook her hand, I cracked her knuckles. I was totally mortified, but she was very sweet about it. Her bodyguards gave me the side eye, but she emanated some of the best energy I have ever experienced. I was too embarrassed after the handshake to ask for an autograph, but I wish I had. I attended a private event with a friend of one of the guests of honor at Emmylou Harris's house a while back. She is a huge animal advocate, takes very good care of her family, and made everyone there feel welcome. I feel lucky remembering these things. I met Dikembe Mutombo when I was working as a hostess at a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta many moons ago, and I remember asking him his shoe size. I think it was around 21 or 23. He was super nice to everyone. I can't forget one of my favorite musicians, Willie Nelson. I met him briefly while he signed the back of my shirt. I came very close to meeting Jimmy Carter at the same concert. Our eyes met and I felt he received my reverence. I also felt his kindness. I got to see B.B. King play his beloved guitar Lucille up close that night. Ted Turner sat a few tables over with 6 women. Now I feel like listening to memories from the Cats soundtrack. Story 33. Epstein, 2006, Whole Foods. He came in demanding a refund for $500 worth of crab cakes he said were bad. He had no receipt. I told him to get the receipt. He handed me his identification and said to get the manager. I called the department it would have been ordered from. They said no order was placed. My manager arrived, apologized, and gave him a cash refund. Epstein left before my manager finished cleaning his shoes with his tongue. I was written up because my drawer was short. Story 34. I worked at an expensive Japanese restaurant in Vancouver for several years. It has been a decade since I was employed there, so now I am happy to share. I never had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I met many rich and famous people. A few notable guests. Mariah Carey. She made zero eye contact and took a table for 6 so her 2 security guards were within her line of sight but far enough away that she could ignore them. They were only allowed to order water. We lost multiple seatings and thousands of dollars in revenue. She tipped at the same rate as an average diner. Chris Hemsworth. He walked in without a reservation. Fortunately, we were able to accommodate him after a rush had cleared, and I, as the manager on duty, worked swiftly to clear an area for him. He hesitated between the bar and a lounge table and placed his hand on the small of my back while I adjusted his seating. I tried not to squeal. He was very kind and obviously friendly. Nicolas Cage. He and his girlfriend sat at the sushi bar and got into an argument. Typical Nicolas Cage. Steven Spielberg. He often came in with his wife and sat at the sushi bar. He was very low-key and demure. Finally, and perhaps least in fame but not in quality, I served Daisy Ridley and a male friend almost daily around the release of the new Star Wars film in which she starred. I had no idea who she was when we first met, and we developed a casual, friendly relationship. I had a trip to London planned to visit my sister, and she gave me a list of can't-miss things to do while there. It was only when another guest told me she was famous that I realized she was not just another tourist passing through. I had the pleasure of serving her again after I returned and had checked all her recommendations off the list. She was very humble and very sweet. Story 35. King Charles was the Prince of Wales when we met. As a boy, I once stood 20 feet away from Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Clay. Story 36. Taylor Swift in New York City back in the day. Nothing crazy. I just took a photo for 10 seconds and told her she was amazing. She said, "Oh God, you're adorable," and hugged me. Story 37. Mark Wahlberg. I work at a corporate office, and as you might know, he has many side businesses outside of acting. Apparently, he was meeting with a business partner in my building and word got around. I heard the rumor but didn't think much of it and continued with my day. I went to lunch, and upon returning, I saw a medium-sized group of women in the lobby. They were whispering and giggling. I assumed they had just seen him and walked right by them. My head was down looking at my phone when, all of a sudden, the group of women ran past me and surrounded me. I tried to work my way through, and then Mark and I bumped into each other. He said sorry, and without missing a beat, I said no, I'm sorry. It's always like this when I come into the office. He laughed, gave me a fist bump, and we went our separate ways. When I got back to my office, I told my wife, and she was mad that I didn't get a picture with him. To be honest, it never crossed my mind, and that experience was better than a picture. Story 38. This was in 2008. I saw Dave Chappelle riding a skateboard in the Fillmore. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Skateboarding." When I asked if I could get a selfie, he said, "No, you caught me slipping," and left. The Fillmore is a neighborhood in San Francisco. I have a few more stories. I met Rosario Dawson in 1997 at a party when I was attending school in New York City. She was very chill. I made out with one of the people there and did not realize it was her until I watched the movie Kids about a year later. Story 39. I met James Earl Jones in a grocery store in Seattle in 1995 while he was filming a television show. We were heading toward each other in the aisle. He was doing his own shopping and I said, "Excuse me, I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciate your work." He replied, "Thank you," in that voice, and we moved on. He impressed me not so much for Star Wars but for The Great White Hope, which came out in 1970. When I was 14, it was one of the first movies I ever saw by myself. Story 40. I was finishing dinner at a small barbecue restaurant when Harrison Ford arrived with his family. There weren't any seats left, and he was figuring out what to do. I said, "We're getting up," and offered him our table. He said, "Thanks, it's crowded." We left. Story 41. Andre Holland was one of the leads in Moonlight, which won Best Picture at the Oscars that year. I was at a music festival when he walked by while I was waiting in line for food. He looked so familiar, so I called him over and asked if he recognized me because I recognized him but could not quite put my finger on it. I asked if he had gone to my high school. He said no. I asked if he had gone to my college. He said no. I said this was going to eat me up, and he replied that he probably just had one of those faces. After he walked off, the girl in line tapped me on the shoulder and said that it was Andre Holland. I was mortified with embarrassment. Story 42. Jimmy Carter was at a fly fishing shop in San Francisco. We had a brief conversation about fishing and where to go. Story 43. I ran into David Spade at the Venetian in Las Vegas. We had seen his show the night before, and he was wearing the same clothes, so he was easy to spot. We stopped him as we walked by. He was very cool, let us take a few pictures, gave us a fist bump, and continued on. Story 44. I received a greeting from Peter Frampton in the hallway of a recording studio. He seemed like a nice person. Story 45. Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5 on their reunion tour in the 1980s. My cousin produced one of Michael Jackson's albums. I was in 5th grade. They were all very nice. That is from the perspective of an elementary school child at the time. Story 46. I sat next to Reggie Jackson on a flight from Las Vegas to Newark. He was wearing a windbreaker that said Mr. October, which tells you everything you need to know about him. But for those who need it spelled out, he is a jerk. Story 47. Vince Vaughn was at the Four Diamonds Casino card room in Los Angeles. He was so awesome. I'm pretty sure I took at least $100 from him. Story 48. That was around 2010. Nick Jonas and his then-girlfriend attended a morning service at my church in an auditorium. They arrived after the lights dimmed and sat several rows ahead of me. When the service ended and the lights came up, I got a clear look. It was him, and no one else seemed to notice. I later learned that the Jonas Brothers were on their way to a show and had stopped here to refuel their plane. Story 49. My uncle on my dad's side hosted a political talk show for many years. Let us just say Daryl Hammond did an excellent impersonation on Saturday Night Live. My uncle did not understand at all why we all found it so funny, which only made it better. Story 50. I slipped and fell in a fancy restaurant directly in front of Gwyneth Paltrow and her mother, Blythe. Neither of them showed any sympathy. Story 51. Dennis Leary. I happened to be in line for a show in New York City, and he was coming out of a side door. I recognized him immediately. He gave me a huge smile and asked, "How are you?" Story 52. I literally bumped into H. John Benjamin at a grocery store in Iowa City, Iowa, about 14 years ago. He was looking at the chip aisle and I tried to squeeze between him and the shelves, accidentally bumping him. I turned to apologize and realized who he was. He smiled. I got so starstruck that I stuttered, said hi, and hurried away. At the checkout, I was explaining to the cashier who he was when he wandered up to the opposite counter with a bag of chips open. Eating. I paid and left quickly. The next day, I met and spent time with Amber Tamblyn. She was awesome. She gave me a copy of her poetry book that she was giving away and signed it, "I adore you." We planned to go to an after-party, but I got distracted while drunk and lost track of where it was, so I did not get to stay. I also met Michael J. Fox briefly at a charity golf event. I met Kevin Nealon after a comedy show. Both signed books for me. I know Josh Johnson from The Daily Show personally. I have hung out with him only a handful of times. The only conversation I remember having with him was about Spider-Man. One of my oldest college friends is his regular opening act for stand-up, and that is how we met. It feels strange to see someone you know become somewhat famous, especially when you were not close but were in the same circle. Story 53. I walked past Woody Harrelson in New York City. Before I could say anything, he smiled, flipped me off, and walked on. Another time I saw Jermaine Clement from Flight of the Conchords eating at a falafel shop. When he saw that I recognized him, he grabbed his falafel and left. Story 54. My son was a volunteer helper at the comic convention where I was working. I went to look for him and was told he was in the green room. This is a curtained-off area where the actors and presenters can get away from the crowds. I was very worried. He should not have been able to go back there because he did not have a pass, and I was afraid he was bothering people. When I went back, I found him at a table with John Rhys-Davies and Steve Downes. David Tennant was standing behind him and joined their conversation. They were discussing Dungeons and Dragons. At first I was mortified and told my son it was time to head back out. All three told me what a great son I had. They really were discussing Dungeons and Dragons with a 13-year-old who had no idea who two of them were. He knew Tennant from Doctor Who. When we first arrived at the convention, he wanted to get a pop figure of Steve Downes, who is the voice actor for his favorite game, Halo. He had never seen a picture of him, so he did not recognize him. Story 55. I was at the adult nightclub at Disney World, Florida. While standing at a urinal, two men in suits with earpieces entered and ordered everyone to remain where they were. I had a close encounter with a very old, very large person I did not recognize because I was facing the wrong way. I later learned it was Bob Hope. You younger listeners may not know who he was, but he was a major star in his day. Story 56. Martin Sheen spoke at my son's college graduation. Afterwards, he took pictures with us. He was a very nice guy. Story 57. I saw Lucille Ball at the Chicago Water Tower. She was alone, standing outside Neiman Marcus. At first I was nonchalant, then I was agape. I did not say anything to her. She seemed to be enjoying her shopping. Who knows? She was very overdressed, even wearing a small fur. This was about 1976, so she was 65 years old at the time. Still, it was Lucille Ball. Story 58. I was at a beach in California with family early on an autumn morning. Pierce Brosnan walked by, waved, and said hello. I waved back and said hello, and he walked on. A few minutes later, he walked in the opposite direction, waved, and said hello again. Humans, am I right? Story 59. I met Francis Ford Coppola. He is a gentleman with very soft hands. Story 60. Wes Studi is a Cherokee Native American actor. He appeared in Dances with Wolves, Hostels, and other films. He is a very relaxed and kind person. He attended the Native American Music Awards in New York and sat and spoke with me for a few minutes. Ocioves. Story 61. I made eye contact and received a nod from Peter Dinklage on Pacific Avenue in Brooklyn. Story 62. Pierce Brosnan. I spilled my coffee in a coffee shop in Kauai and did not recognize him because his hair was completely gray. He was very polite. I recognized him later, and my wife yelled at me when I would not put him on the phone with her. Story 63. I had a smoke with Matthew McConaughey behind the Four Seasons in Toronto. This was just before he really broke out. He was a good guy and asked about local restaurants. Story 64. Duke the dog from Bush's Beans. It went great. He was brought to my university for pictures and sponsored our football game, I guess. Story 65. I was at work when Morgan Freeman arrived with a group of people for a meeting. Everyone went around the table introducing themselves. One person said, "I am Steve. I am the social media manager for Paramount Studios." When it was his turn, Morgan Freeman simply said, "I am Morgan Freeman, and I am an actor." It was classic. Story 66. Method Man was at a Foot Locker. I was hanging out there and he asked me what I thought about these shoes. We spent an hour or so talking. It was strange, but he is very nice. Story 67. Alan Thicke was a fantastic guy. I met him in Niagara Falls. He introduced me to his children. Not Robin. I was joking. We spoke for 20 minutes about being Canadian and life in Canada. Story 68. Uma Thurman came into the fine dining restaurant where I used to work. She was very nice. I recognized her immediately and showed her to the table where I knew her friends. A pair of regulars were waiting. By the end of the evening, she was hanging out with the owner on the porch of our show kitchen across the street, drinking grappa and doing high kicks in her evening gown. This was shortly after Kill Bill. Story 69. Outside a Los Angeles Kings game, I left early for some reason and ducked out through a side exit. Standing outside, looking lost, was Harrison Ford. We looked at each other. There was no one around and I kept going. Story 70. James Garner was practicing his putting at Pebble Beach in the early 1980s. He was there alone on a quiet day with no crowds. My husband and I were having brunch on the patio and said hello. Princess Diana attended a charity lunch in Ottawa in 1991. Lovely. Story 71. Before his vice presidency, Biden and Jazzy Jeff were in the same place. Story 72. On our honeymoon in 1982 in St. Croix, we ran out of money and had to wait until some could be wired the next day. We were staying in a cool, funky local hotel, and while we were in the lobby lamenting our plight, a man walked up and offered to take us to dinner. He was from Oregon, an avid runner, and said he was working on launching a sneaker brand. He was very kind. It turned out to be Phil Knight of Nike. Story 73. I served bread to Vin Diesel, Paul Walker, and the rest of the Fast Five cast in Puerto Rico at the hotel's fine dining restaurant where I worked during filming. The manager said that if anyone pulled out a phone or camera, they would be immediately terminated. Story 74. Diane Keaton owns property where I live. I saw her at a Circle K. She was smiling, pleasant with the cashier, and humble. Story 75. At an In-N-Out Burger in Las Vegas. I held the door open for Celine Dion and her family. The bodyguards were huge. Story 76. Nancy Kerrigan is a figure skater. I met her at the rink. I had no idea who she was, but I complimented her figure skating skills. We had a nice 10-minute talk about the Olympics and her life afterward. Only when I got home did my husband tell me who she was and show me a movie made about her. I felt silly, laughing out loud. She was very nice and friendly. Story 77. Olivia de Havilland outside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I was 18 and loved old movies. I recognized her, called out Miss de Havilland, And she turned to me smiling and said yes. I began a short speech about her talent and told her she was a gift to mankind. She smiled and asked if I was enjoying my stay in Paris. I said something, and she replied that she had to go because she was late and her taxi was there. She waved and rode off. She was lovely, dressed beautifully in a gorgeous suit. Truly a movie star. Story 78. I stood at a San Francisco crosswalk next to Clint Eastwood in 1992. I was so awestruck that I could not get a word out. The light changed, and he walked quickly across the street, leaving my friend and me staring at each other, wondering what had just happened. Story 79. Tom Hanks was at the Cleveland Clinic main cafeteria in 2006. He was taller than I thought he would be, and he was a very nice man. Story 80. David Beckham and Terry Crews ate at the restaurant where I worked in Legoland years ago. Both were very nice. The coolest experience for me was a couple of guys from A Day to Remember at a brewery where I worked before their show. Story 81. Mark McKinney of the Kids in the Hall was trying to find the banquet hall at a venue while the Juno Awards were in town, and I pointed him the way. The experience was pleasant. He was friendly, and I was excited to meet a member of the Kids in the Hall but stayed calm rather than becoming an overexcited fan. Story 82. This may be a stretch for younger people outside the United States of America. My young daughters and I were visiting a music museum. A handsome older man got out of a limousine with two younger women. He opened the front door for my daughters and me with a huge smile. I said, "Girls, Tony Bennett just opened the door for you." They were like, "Who?" Story 83. I was working in a nursing home kitchen, and one of my jobs was serving in the formal dining room. I came through the swinging doors with a large tray on my shoulder and nearly ran into Penn Jillette, who was standing in front of the door. It turned out one of our residents was his much older sister. Story 84. Eric Clapton. He came through my register at a record store in Irving, Texas. I knew who he was, and he knew it. I sold him his CD, smiled, and said something stupid like, "All right." It was like a Sasquatch sighting. No one else in the store noticed him, and when I told them, they did not believe me. Story 85. In 2016, my husband and I flew to London to see The Cursed Child. It was the second night of the play, and we popped into a pub near the theater for a quick bite. We saw a man commanding a table. He was laughing and sounded American. My husband said he thought it was Mark Hamill. We tried to eavesdrop, and I heard enough to believe it was him. My husband was giddy and nervous. He wanted a picture but did not want to bother him, so when Mark Hamill walked by our table, I politely asked. He was happy to oblige. He said he was also in town to see the play, so we briefly chatted about how amazing the first night had been. I have shared this before, but I met Leonardo DiCaprio when I worked at the Gap in Harvard Square around 2008. He was rude. I also bumped into LeBron James outside Lure in Midtown Atlanta several years ago, and all I could say was that he was very tall. He smirked down at me. I am under 5 feet tall. I have met and drunkenly kissed a few cast members from the real world back in college. Yikes. Story 86. I sold Sam Shepard a magazine when he was filming in Calgary. Story 87. I met Method Man while working at a leather booth at the New York Comic Con. Story 88. I sold vintage sweaters to Carrie Russell at a pop-up shop in New York City in 2014. I had no idea who she was while helping her. After she left, everyone else at the market said, "You were the only booth Carrie shopped from." Story 89. Back entrance to the Chateau Marmont. David and Victoria Beckham were there beside the staircase. Her top had fallen down and he was adjusting her straps. Her back was to my friend and me. We did not see anything, but she was clearly embarrassed. We said, "Hello, pardon us," and kept walking. Story 90. Not really fair. My dad was a music critic when I was growing up. We went to see Hootie and the Blowfish at the Syndome in Tampa. My dad had to find a pay phone backstage to send his story back to headquarters. They used landlines and a modem that transmitted from a laptop to the server over the telephone back then. Suddenly the band came out from behind the stage, beers in hand. My dad was on the phone with his editor. I was about 10 and stood next to them. He gave me the "go talk to them" look. I was a huge fan and still am. I said hi and told them it was a great show. Darius said, "Thanks. Want a beer?" I looked at my dad. He gave me a thumbs up, but I declined. In hindsight, I wish I had taken a swig. I come from a bluegrass background and have great memories of Uncle Tony Rice, Sam Bush, Chubby Wise, Bella Fleck, Alison Krauss, John Duffy, and Chris Thile. They were all wonderful people. I worked as a stagehand in college and met many artists in passing, Usher or Of a Revolution, Jimmy Buffett, and others. I literally ran into Steven Tyler while carrying a road box. He said, "Whoa, watch out, dude," in the nicest, very Steven Tyler way. Story 91. We were connecting in Salt Lake City. My wife kept looking over her shoulder as we walked to our gate. She whispered something while looking back. I asked her to repeat it. She said, "I think that's Danny Trejo, but I'm not sure. You may hate me for this, but I did not recognize him, so I asked plainly, 'Sir, my wife thinks you are Danny Trejo. Are you?' He shook my hand and my wife's, and agreed to a quick photo with us. Proper gentleman. I looked him up afterward. A good person. Story 92. I met Ghostface Killah at a random party in Richmond, Virginia, near Virginia Commonwealth University, when my friends and I were visiting my younger brother. After a Wu-Tang Clan show earlier that night, he went out to bless the streets. Because I was the only person who was not fawning over him, and I happened to be carrying several types of alcohol in a large jacket with many pockets, we spent about 20 to 30 minutes together drinking bourbon, smoking, and talking about random things. He learned an awful lot about bourbon that night, which I found amusing. The only reason I could recognize him in a very dark Richmond alley was that he had his face and name on a full vehicle wrap of the sport utility vehicle he arrived in. Story 93. I once met Robert Englund, who played Freddy Krueger, at Walmart. I wanted a picture with him. This was before cell phones. My brother tried to take the picture but accidentally recorded a video, so he stood there recording when a photo should have been taken. Robert yelled in his Freddy voice, "Take the picture, piggy!" before my brother finally stopped recording. He was a genuine, friendly guy having fun with us. Story 94. I was standing outside John F. Kennedy International Airport smoking a cigarette when a black town car pulled up and Mike Wallace stepped out. As the driver removed his bags from the trunk, Mike Wallace asked how I was doing, said he knew my hometown and had even been there. I asked where he was going. He said he was going to do a story and that he was nervous but excited. He shook my hand and wished me well. Total class act. Story 95. John F. Kennedy Jr. walked away from the courthouse when he was an assistant district attorney in New York City. Story 96. Lindsay Lohan. This was about 20 years ago in Los Angeles. A friend brought her to the bar to hang out with us. We were sitting at a table having a good time, chatting and drinking. Someone passed a joint around, and Lindsay pulled out a crack pipe and hit it like it was no big deal. Everyone froze, then looked at each other mouthing, "What the heck?" Pretty much stopped the evening dead in its tracks. Story 97. For boxing fans. I met Roberto Duran in South San Francisco at a friend's house. Then 2 carloads of us went to a nightclub in San Jose. It was crazy. We did not pay for anything at the club. Story 98. Maybe not the most famous, but one I highly respected. Anthony Bourdain. He was kind and polite while I stammered about how amazing he was. It was the only time I have ever been starstruck. Story 99. Gene Simmons is sometimes in my city because his wife is from here. I was in the mall about 10 years ago, waiting at the ATM, when I heard a child behind me scream, "Daddy!" The man in front of me, and I turned around. I am a woman, but a child calling for a parent gets my attention, and when I looked back, it was Gene. Everyone in my town acts cool around celebrities. It is a small place, and we do not want to drive away tourists. So I smiled and said, "Thanks for everything." He smiled, shook my hand, and took his turn at the ATM. Story 100. I sang a song on stage with Iggy Pop, and we hugged. His skin was so soft. Story 101. I gave Emmett Smith a ride in my Uber twice. He was very nice and humble with a great sense of humor. He was an excellent tipper. Story 102. I was waiting for the same flight as William H. Macy and his wife, Felicity Huffman, while Desperate Housewives was at its peak. I was about 14, a big fan of both, and holding my beloved Build-A-Bear when their young daughter gently took it from me. They returned it and chatted with me, and I was completely starstruck. Antonio Banderas was also on our flight and picked up my mum's sunglasses when she dropped them in the aisle. She was equally starstruck. Story 103. I bumped into Cliff Richard in the lift in Fortnum's once. He did not recognize me at all. Story 104. Paul Rudd. I was Christmas shopping at Barnes & Noble 2 days before Christmas, and our family ran into him. He is every bit as nice and as amazing as he appears in the movies. Story 105. I got a tour of the White House at the same time as Fat Joe. Story 106. I had courtside seats at a Lakers game back in 2006 or 2007. I sat right next to Alex Trebek. My father and I had a pleasant conversation with him. He asked me about school and where I planned to attend university. Story 107. I once worked in a deli in Jackson Hole. Harrison Ford asked me if the vegan chili had meat in it. I told him it was vegan. The funny thing is I was also working at a different deli down the road at a family-owned resort. Dornan's. Customers filled out order slips to customize sandwiches. He ordered roast beef with horseradish. I know this because I saved his order slip. So I served Harrison Ford food twice, in 2 different places. Story 108. More than 20 years ago, my brother and I were walking off a massive hangover in Manhattan the day before his wedding. We walked right past Paul McCartney, his wife, a stroller, and a bodyguard. He looked straight at us and did not react. About 500 feet down the sidewalk, I turned to my brother and asked, "Was that John Lennon?" I think he was sad not to be recognized. "I am sorry, Sir Paul." Story 109. Bill Murray spilled gasoline on my then-girlfriend's sweater. He was very apologetic and down-to-earth. He could not have been nicer. Story 110. Mark Henry, the wrestler and strongman, lived in Austin, and I worked at a bowling alley there. He rented size 17 shoes, which were the largest size we carried. The late Jason David Frank, the original Green Ranger, used to go rock climbing where I worked. He mostly did not want to interact with people and was somewhat rude when he did. Story 111. Rhett and Link are from Good Mythical Morning. I ran into both of them in Nashville in 2019. I passed Link on the street and did not realize who he was until I was shoulder to shoulder with him. About 10 minutes later, I ran into Rhett at a guitar store. I did not say anything to either of them because I did not want to bother them. Story 112. I saw Bill Murray twice. I was an extra in a Judge Reinhold movie, and the scene was shot at the Riviera, a cool old theater in Chicago. I was leaning against a railing when a man walked up and leaned too. It was Bill Murray. I said, "Hey," and he said, "Nice pants." I was wearing zebra pants. It was 1988. This summer, I was at a Joliet Slammers game where they were doing a hot dog drop to set a Guinness World Record. A man was throwing out the hot dogs with the young staff and he yelled, "Red Dog," and tossed one to me. He is a co-owner of the team and shows up often. He is great at supporting Joliet small businesses. I am a redhead. Story 113. I almost knocked down Stephen King. During the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, I worked as an operating room nurse at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, the large army hospital in Germany where wounded service members were received from downrange. Because of that, we had a continuous stream of singers, bands, athletes, comedians, politicians, actors, and more visiting wounded troops. You could be eating lunch in the dining facility and Stephen Baldwin or Carlos Mencia would sit down next to you. Oprah's partner Stedman once asked, "Where's the cutlery?" While I was getting a salad. I got on the elevator and there was Kid Rock. 5 astronauts showed up at the nurses' station when I was in charge one day. One of the scrub technicians got in trouble for chasing Wee Man past the holding area because he had gone over the red line in street clothes. Angelina Jolie was at the nurses' station in the intensive care unit when I went to pick up a patient for surgery. I had to wade through the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders to get to the medical library, and the Harlem Globetrotters stopped by the Four Corners desk. Those are just a few examples. It was never ending. One day, I was returning a fresh postoperative patient to the intensive care unit and walking out with another nurse who helped push the bed. The exit to the intensive care unit and the intensive care unit waiting room were immediately next to each other. As we walked out to go back to the operating room, I turned to the right because she was saying something, and at that instant a man walked out of the waiting room pulling a Landstuhl Regional Medical Center t-shirt on over his head, and I bumped right into him. I grabbed him so he would not fall and said, "Oh my God. I'm so sorry, sir." His head popped up from the t-shirt and it was Stephen King. He said he was fine and asked if we were nurses. When we said yes, he grinned, opened his arms wide and said, "I love nurses." He talked with us for almost 5 minutes until the handler assigned to him at the hospital led him away. My favorite, though, was Gary Sinise. He was one of the few who would stop in at the operating room and ask if there were any patients in the operating room holding area waiting to go back for surgery. Since that area was not considered a sterile area, he could go in there in street clothes. He would go in and find a row of beds with patients who had horrific injuries waiting their turn for wound care. He would go to each one, shake hands when possible, and say quietly, "Hi, I'm Gary. Where are you from?" You could see them perk up despite pain, exhaustion, and depression. He spent time with each person asking about their lives. He came through several times in the years I worked there. He was always soft-spoken and sincere. I loved the work he did for those service members. He was genuine and kind. I will never forget the way he was with them. It seemed to come so naturally to him. Story 114. Tony L. Chutri Ferguson is a super nice guy. Tony Ferguson was coming off the elevator with his family while I was boarding with mine. He instantly noticed I was starstruck, patted me on the shoulder, and said, "Hey brother, what's up?" I could not say anything. I just smiled widely and offered a fist bump. He bumped my fist and continued walking with his family. I wish I could have asked for an autograph or a picture, but the fist bump was more than enough. Later we saw Chuck Liddell. I asked him for a picture. He was also very nice and had huge hands. My wife commented and he laughed. Story 115. I met Judge Reinhold when I worked at Whole Foods. I asked if he was the guy from Fast Times at Ridgemont High and told him I loved the movie. He seemed annoyed, so I did not say more. I also talked to Billy Bob Thornton on the phone while working at the same Whole Foods. I was helping his mother with some errands, and she put him on the phone. He was very pleasant and had a smooth voice. Story 116. I shook George W. Bush's hand at a rally when I was 8. Other than that, I was a host at the Thank God It's Fridays restaurant in Cincinnati. One day, a man with a rainbow mohawk came in with his mother. I seated them. Later, my coworker told me he was the lead singer of the band Walk the Moon. I had heard their music but was not familiar with the band, so I did not recognize his face. Story 117. I once rode 12 floors down in an elevator with Stevie Wonder. I was too shy to say anything. Story 118. Danny Bonaduce at a concert long before the age of smartphones. My mom spotted him first and said, "I watched you on the Partridge Family as a kid. Nice to meet you. This is my daughter." He said thank you, shook her hand, and waved at me. Story 119. I ran into Eric Estrada at Disneyland. He was a really nice guy and even took a picture with my wife and eldest daughter. Story 120. Harrison Ford was there many years ago at the airport on Martha's Vineyard. My friend flew private charters and I was along for the ride. We were waiting by the plane while the clients had lunch. Mr. Ford was learning to fly and liked my friend's plane, so he came over to talk to us. We spoke about planes and flying for about 20 minutes. We did not say anything until he was ready to leave. My friend asked, "Are you?" implying we recognized him. He said yes, we shook hands, and he walked away. He was one of the nicest people I have ever met. Story 121. In the span of a couple of hours, I showed Questlove around, fist bumped LL Cool J, and told one of the Go-Go's, either Jane Weedlin or Gina Shock, I cannot remember which, that she had really cool boots. I was also about 20 feet from the Foo Fighters and Chuck D. Then on separate occasions I jammed with Flavor Flav, who is a really good drummer. I played bass and we did Hey Jude. I performed live on Turner Network Television with Shaquille O'Neal, Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, and Ernie Johnson. I bumped into Shaka Khan one day. I bumped into Jimmy Jam while clocking out at work. I bumped into Dante Bosco. I got songwriting advice from Ben Folds. Those are the ones I recall. I worked at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and those were just a fraction of the people who came in. Story 122. Russell Crowe's grandmother used to live in a granny flat near my home. One day he walked down the driveway and asked, "Is my grandmother home?" This was before he became famous. His cousins were well-known cricket players. Story 123. Dave Matthews. I was 17 and walking to school. We were both waiting at a crosswalk. I hit the button and he said, "You know, those things don't actually do anything." I said yes and chuckled slightly. The light changed and that was it. Very mundane experience. 5 out of 10. Another, somewhat darker one involves Bill Nye. I was 12 with my mom and sister on a shuttle bus taking us to a resort in North Carolina where my mom was going to give a talk. Bill Nye was sitting across from us and made a lewd remark to my mom about hotel bathrobes. I was a huge fan at the time, which made the situation even weirder. 1 out of 10. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.